Hello, and welcome back to Movie Zone.
Today I'm going to explain the movie called Lifelike from 2019. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care, and I hope you enjoy it. The movie begins with James and Sophie walking through a huge building. James tries to make Sophie realize that it's the future. She must be excited, not just bored of what's happening. The scene fades to 3 months back, where Sophie insists James get her couch repaired. James, along with the man, brings it back home all settled and repaired. They both exchange a couple of kisses when the phone rings. James picks up the call and Sophie stares at him in complete unsettlement. The next scene begins with James and Sophie standing outside a big house, where she tells him that she isn't ready for it, but she knows she has to do it for James. The next morning, James leaves for the job, and Sophie comes downstairs. She finds a woman and a man in the kitchen. She looks at them and then goes back. The woman knocks on the door to her room and asks if she needs soup or anything else. Sophie replies that she doesn't require anything and she's not like James. She hasn't been brought up like this, so she doesn't require these formalities. She orders her to take a rest and leave her alone. James is seen sitting at his late father's office chair, where now he needs to look up to the business that his father left. Rosa, the woman in the house, comes to Sophie and tells her about the living room that needs to be fixed. Sophie insists that she would do it by herself. Rosa tells her that it's her job and she's happy with it. To this statement, Sophie replies if she thought about this as her dream life to be. She said she wants to feel comfortable in this house, and so wants her to be as well. Sophie says to Rosa that she can spend her life however she thinks will be ideal. She calls back out to him and tells him that she's in the bathroom. James comes inside and asks where everyone is. Sophie says that she's fired them all. He gets confused and asks why she's done this. Sophie replies that she found them an ultimate distraction and that she wanted them to live their dreams. Rosa hadn't met her parents for the last 14 years, and she just gave them the freedom. James said that she's totally crazy. It was their livelihood, their way of earning. But he insists on being good to her. She moves closer to him and says this entire mansion is now for us, and we're alone here. She unbuttons his shirt, and James pulls off hers. James pushes her to the bed and starts kissing her with all his might. In the next scene, James tries to tell his employees what to perform and how to do the specific given task. They give different suggestions when the phone rings. A worker says that it's an urgent call. James takes the call and finds Sophie asking him for help in the lawn. He replies that he's at work and would do it tonight. At night, James begins to work in the dark and feels very frustrated. Sophie sees him up from the window. The next day, Sophie calls James and has an informal chat about the existence here in the new town. She says that she's uncountable questions of why they're here. James tells her to just stop questioning and accept the reality. James talks to his assistant and tells him how he used to receive a monthly allowance from his father, and that's what he thought his life would stay like. His assistant advises that he can leave anytime he wants. But James refuses as he finds it more real than that. But the fact that his wife fired people from the house makes him disgusted. This new rich life can't progress without homemaids. The next scene connects to the first, where Sophie and James enter a huge building. They approach a room where different robots are standing who seem more like humans, and a man tells the specialties. To one female robot, he says Jessica is the best of all. James tries to convince Sophie to have her at home, but she feels really reluctant. She says that she wants to be the most beautiful girl at home, and James finds that she's kind of jealous of the mere robot. He tries to convince her that she will always remain like that. Sophie asks him to go for a male instead, as it would make her less uneasy. The advisor, Mulroy, says that each of them is made to represent a perfect version of humanity, for which Sophie suggests they should put them in museums instead of houses. But the man says that they obey whatever they're asked to. He calls Henry and asks him to sit in front of James and lick his shoes. He does that, and Sophie freaks out. They go into the room where everything is being worked. The man tells them that he's their personal advisor, so if any problems, such as communication problems, arise, they must contact him. In the next scene, Sophie enters the kitchen and finds Henry cooking eggs for James. He asks if she needs anything, but she refuses. She tells James that she sees a human in him, and that she can make her own breakfast. James says to her that she should do that, but she can't possibly do all the work in the house. Sophie goes to the kitchen and finds everything set on the dinner table. She finds a note that says, "I know you don't like to have your breakfast made by anyone else, but since I was making one for James, I couldn't spill the leftovers. Let me know if any further help is needed. Henry." Sophie smiles seeing that. In the next scene, Sophie comes out of her washroom all naked. and as she wears her gown, she turns around and sees Henry. She immediately ties her belt and orders him to get out of the room. Sophie calls James and tells that she felt he was staring at her body, but James refuses to believe that. He says he might have been looking at it, but not staring. Sophie asks him to come home as she's alone and feels uncomfortable, but he refuses, saying he's busy. He advises her to send him to his docking station. James comes home at night and asks for Henry. Sophie says that he's being charged at the docking station, so it's not good to call him at this hour. James says that he's a robot and that he can be charged in the morning. James calls him to play tennis. Henry asks if something is up with him, as he seems stressed out. James replies that he finds him that way because he is. Henry asks if he can help. James says that he just wants him to play tennis with him. They play tennis, and in ultimate anger, James hits the ball. At one point, he screams loudly. He exchanges a little chat with Henry, and Henry pays his condolences for James's father. He tells him that his father's death has been the greatest change in his life. James says to Henry that he likes him, and he likes how he takes care of him, and Henry says the feeling is mutual. The next morning, Sophie asks James how his late-night session with Henry has been. James tells her that it has been so good. It feels good to talk to someone who you know wouldn't have it fed. It's just you talking to your own self. In the next scene, Sophie tries to teach Henry how to sew the couch. Henry asks if it's important for her, and she says yes, as it's been a part of one of her dreams. It's good to have dreams, says Henry. Sophie asks if robots have dreams, to which Henry replies that it's not a part of their programming. In the next scene, Sophie, after doing ample work with Henry, asks if he needs to have a break. Henry asks back if she wants him to take the break, and she does. She hands over him a book after placing aside an envelope that shows James on it. Henry takes it, and Sophie tells him to read one chapter daily, so that they can have a conversation about it. In the next scene, Sophie sits with Henry discussing the chapter of the book. She asks if he feels the intimacy. He questions if she wants him to feel that, and Sophie nods. The next scene shows Sophie and James resting on the beach chairs, Sophie reading a book. Henry brings a jug of juice when Sophie asks him if the character in the chapter was lusty. Henry explains that lust is a feeling that makes people realize things are possible that they usually find impossible. Lust is conditional, while love is unconditional. Lust feels like love at times, until it's time to make sacrifices. Sophie and James argue about these terms, when Henry says that lust is a flow and love is a feeling. He says that he wonders why lust isn't mentioned that way. On asking, Henry says that, to me, lust is a desire for someone, something sensual. Sophie asks him if he feels lust, and he replies only if they want him to. James gets furious and says that it isn't necessary. At night, Sophie hears some noise. She gets up and goes outside. She calls out to Henry, but no one replies. She moves towards the voices with a stick in her hand, as she feels horror and fear surrounding her. She goes out and finds Henry naked lying on the lawn. She calls him by his name, and he wakes up. He asks her where he is, and she tells him that he's in a house. He again poses the question of how he came there. Sophie asks him if he's dreaming. He agrees and tells her that he dreamt he was a human. She holds his hand and takes him inside. Henry begins to fall when she catches him, and suddenly James turns on the light. He sees Sophie holding him with one hand and placing another on his chest. James asks Henry why he's outside, and he just falls. James takes him inside. The next day, Malroy tells him that it was just a glitch. Someone is making him feel like a human. Don't put emotions into a machine. If someone treats him like a person, he might become one. Sophie and James fight over him, and Sophie tells how she has to chat with a machine just because her husband doesn't have time for her. The next scene starts with Sophie entering the room and James lighting the candles. Sophie enters and tells that she isn't in the mood and leaves. Later, Sophie sits with Henry in front of the fireplace, where Henry tells her about his dreams. He tells Sophie that it's in his programming to please her, and he knows his dream pleases her. Sophie agrees and says that it makes her feel intrigued, and that he feels like a human at times. In the next scene, Sophie lies on her back naked, and Henry massages her back with oil. While massaging, he begins kissing her back, and Sophie suddenly opens her eyes. He continues kissing her neck, and Sophie turns to her front side. Henry and Sophie kiss each other on the lips, and Henry climbs on top of her, kissing. James calls Sophie 2 times, and she wakes up with a jerk. She finds herself on the bed lying with James, as he says good morning. She realizes that it was a dream and takes a sigh of relief. James tells Sophie how he misses his home back in the city. She tells him that they already knew this wasn't going to be easy, but James claims he never thought it would be this hard. Sophie says that sometimes she thinks they need to get out of the bubble, be vulnerable, as vulnerability is the birthplace of love. He asks her where she's heard that, and she says that Henry told her this. In the next scene, Sophie enters her room with bra and underwear on with an open gown. She lets the door open and lays on the bed. She touches herself and moans. She moans heavily and screams. She gets up when she hears some creaks and asks Henry, who is going down the stairs, if he was watching her. He asks what if he was. She orders him to make breakfast and surprise her with anything. In the next scene, she sits in the pool with Henry and asks what makes him smile. He says that her smile makes him smile. James, on the other side, talks to Malroy and tells him that he feels Henry is falling for his wife. He refuses completely, as he's incapable of it. James says that he's impacting his married life, and the advisor asks if he wants to return him back or wants to exchange him. Malroy asks him for permission to say something. He says that Henry is just a reflection of the desires of his keeper. Is it a possibility that Sophie wants him to adore her and give her affection? There's nothing wrong in that, as he's just getting jealous of a vibrator. He advises him to have a conversation with his wife instead of talking about Henry here. Later at night, James asks Henry if he's attracted to Sophie. Henry replies that Sophie wants that attraction, and she feels like he should do this. And pleasing her is his job, but he needs to maintain the balance between both his keepers. James stops him to flirt with Sophie, but he demands a unified decision. Henry tells him that his senses say that Sophie expects it from him. He asks the question again if his love is fading for Sophie. So he is inducing change, not Henry. James orders him to go to his docking station and not sit with Sophie or share any books. The next morning, Henry tells Sophie that James doesn't want them to read together and that he requires a unified directive from both. Sophie fights with James and begins to pack her bags. She leaves. At night, after having a bath, James calls Henry to shave his beard. He turns back and finds Henry naked the same way he is. He gets closer and starts kissing James and tries to play with his body. In the next scene, Henry uncovers Sophie and massages her. He asks her to turn over and looks at the other side. He asks her to close her eyes and gives her a neck massage. He kisses Sophie on the lips, and they both exchange a number of kisses. He says that he loves her, and she asks why he's done this. He replies that he wishes to please her. She gets up immediately and asks why he said it that way. Tears start rolling down her face, and she orders him to leave. James comes back home and finds Sophie smoking. He asks her what happened. Sophie says that Henry kissed her. James starts screaming, and he says to Sophie that she brought it upon herself. Henry found the void in her. Sophie tells James that he made a face just like him while confessing. James goes to the docking station and starts an argument. He slaps him hard and breaks the entire system around. The next morning, Sophie asks James to stay until Malroy comes, but he leaves. She goes to her wardrobe and freaks out as she sees Henry coming towards her. Henry, with swollen eyes, asks what's wrong. Sophie says that James is really upset with him that he kissed her. Henry gets emotional and cries. He wishes that he could understand emotions so that they don't throw him outside. Sophie clarifies nothing like that is happening. Henry suggests Sophie to talk to James because if he's doubting her love, he's a hypocrite. Because he agreed to do things to him in lust that she denied. Sophie leaves for his office and asks Malroy to stay home until she comes back. Malroy orders Henry to get back to his docking station, but he refuses. Sophie enters James's office and sits with him on the floor. She asks if he was attracted to Henry, but James claims that it was just the circumstances that made him do this unintentionally. Both of them cry and apologize for what they had to do in order to get each other back. They both get home and find Henry standing naked in the backyard. They ask him where Malroy is, when he replies that he's gone. Sophie says that he was supposed to be here. Henry talks at his back and whines that he wasn't his maker and that he needs to be at peace for a while. The next scene shows the police all around the building and media covering the area. Sophie and James find that Malroy was a fraud and that Henry and all the other robots are actually humans. They both bring the cops home and hear gunshots in the backyard. They see Malroy with a gun in his hand. He cries and tells them that he found Henry at the age of 3 when he was injured and wounded. He was an abandoned child, and Malroy took care of him and transferred the love he gave to them, and they rejected him just the way his mother did. He loads his gun to shoot them when Henry comes from the back and kills him. Henry sits on his feet and stabs a knife into his chest. Sophie and James move towards him. Henry says that he's tired of this world, and all his feelings, emotions, dreams, and his love was real. He apologizes for ruining their lives and falls on the ground. Sophie caresses him one last time and hugs James, crying heavily. The movie closes with Sophie and James sitting at a park calling their son Henry, who they named after a special part in their lives. To watch more explanations of these kinds of movies, click on the videos on your screen.